Thank you very much, George, for setting the scene and for joining us also for today's session. Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning, Anna. Thank you for having me.
And congratulations for your appointment. Is it Executive Director at the Flickr Foundation, right?
I know it's good news. I mean, it's still coming together. So you know we're still establishing stuff. But yeah, that's the plan. It's really exciting.
Excellent. I mean, I think it's really exciting and great to have you here. I think our chat back at Zoom was also like vibrating with both of your speeches, with a lot of questions, with a lot of interesting remarks. So we will see how we can answer to all of the questions, which are coming up plenty. I would perhaps start by asking a follow-up question to you, George, because based on what we've heard from the policy side, from Ivo, I would be curious to get a reaction from you and to assess what can the idea of digital public spaces bring to European data spaces as the European Commission is envisioning it.
So just start off with an easy question. Well, I mean, I found myself as I was preparing for this meeting, just sort of thinking about digital public space and even just digital space. And I think that term is very kind of cloudy for me. So I found it useful to kind of break it into a few constituent parts. You know, a digital space is made up of user behaviors. It's made up of content. It's made up of the operations that drive the service. You know, it's not just a website. There's all kinds of elements to it. And data, I believe, is just one of the aspects of a digital space. So each of those elements, you know, content, behaviors, data, they all need to be thought through from a social point of view, from an identity and trust point of view. So I mean, I love the idea of lots and lots of data for people to consume and use and understand. But we have to be really careful that citizens understand how that data is created and how it's shared. You know, Ivo mentioned kind of provenance and trustworthiness of that kind of information. And you know, we've seen in the last sort of decade a lot of appropriate criticism of big data sources being passed around without sort of, you know, the proper oversight. So, you know, I think there's, for me, at least in my mind, there's sort of a sedimentary layer, isn't it? This concept of a data space in a much more kind of social environment.
Thank you very much, Ivo. Perhaps you would like to follow up and react on it.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, George. What you mentioned about data can be all types of data, and we have to be careful. I think there the concept of governance comes in. So part of a data space is indeed making sure that it's clear who can use what data, but also making clear what is the status of certain types of data. So I think that's a very important element for a data space that definitely needs to be taken into account.
And now a follow-up question from for you, Ivo, because I would like to refer back to Commissioner Breton's welcome address. He has emphasized on the one hand the importance to preserve cultural heritage, but also at the very end he mentioned the importance of the reuse of digital cultural heritage content. So I just wondered if you could please elaborate a bit more on that, because I believe that's something that for our audience will be very interesting and important to hear from the Commission side, and how can digital cultural heritage institutions can benefit from it.
Yes, I think there's two questions in one there. So what about the reuse, and how can the cultural heritage institutions benefit from this, right? Now, obviously, cultural heritage is there to be consumed by the citizens. Consumed is perhaps not even the right word, to be enjoyed by the citizens. But cultural heritage can also be a creative motor for all kinds of innovative services, for games, for design, for tourism. So basically, the objects that are being made available in Europeana, or more in general by the cultural heritage institutions, they can be reused in many different ways for new services, for new digital products. And we would like to stimulate that kind of reuse of cultural heritage material. It's a win-win for everyone. Now, then you had the second part of your question, which is more, what's in it for the cultural heritage institutions? Well, Harry talked about sharing a dream. I would talk about sharing a purpose and sticking together in the digital world as cultural heritage institutions. Perhaps just to use an image, you may know the game theoretical model of the deer hunt. It's about a group of hunters, think about cultural institutions in this case, that are hunting together. And actually, they know that if they catch the deer, they're after this deer, they will all have food at the end of the day, all of them, right? And then suddenly one of the hunters sees a rabbit. And the hunter knows that if he or she goes after the rabbit, he or she will have to eat that evening, but the others may not catch the deer. So what is the hunter going to do? What is the decision? Do you stick together? And are you going to go for the vision, the purpose, the deer? Or are you going to go for an exclusive deal with one big company, for example? I mean, that's not for the hunters, but that's more for the cultural institutions. So the importance there is sharing a purpose and working together as cultural heritage organizations in a digital age. Now, that is very theoretical. Of course, at the more practical level, this is about benefiting from common services, benefiting from common tools, from infrastructures. It's about money. It's about funding at the European level. It's about funding at the national level at the end of the day. Then again, I think that working together as cultural institutions to make the most of the opportunities of the digital world is really the core.
Thank you very much. Before we kick off with the full panel, I would like perhaps to ask you a first question that we got from the audience. In this case, is from Marco Strefkirk, and we'll be able to follow up also with the panel. He asks, does the cultural heritage sector deserve a data space in its own right? Or should we look for collaboration and value exchange with applications of cultural heritage with health or with tourism? Perhaps, George, you would like to jump in first?
Well, I think to follow up on Ivo's point, the information and content that surrounds us in cultural heritage land is applicable in all kinds of different aspects. And in fact, I think today I would sort of point to engineering culture and engineering training as a place where history and culture education could be really helpful, you know, awareness of humanities. I guess my first thought in reaction to that question is about you know, how you would translate cultural heritage data into other sectors or transform it into other places, and that could be a challenge. But yeah, it'd be. I wish the question asker could be a part of the conversation so we could hear more about the way they're imagining that. But I mean, you know, in general, that's the sort of the promise of open data repositories, isn't it? That it can be these databases can be taken by unexpected consumers out there in the world and repurposed in a way that you couldn't necessarily anticipate as the data creator.
If I could ask Ivo for a quick follow-up on this question as well.
No, that's a very good and important question. So why do we have these data spaces in the first place? Well, we came from the concept of a European data space. So why do we have data spaces in plural, right? Because we realized that the types of data and also who decides about the data is quite different in different sectors. So when you talk about health data, there are specificities that are completely different from manufacturing data and that are different from cultural heritage sector data. So that's why we try to structure this in terms of data spaces, individual data spaces. But the point is very important that we should not create new silos, that there is an interaction between cultural heritage material and other sectors very, very much possible. And indeed, that is the type of interactions that we should also be looking at, because a lot of the value creation out of data, out of content, is going to be between sectors and not just within one sector. Having said that, starting with governance and infrastructures for the individual sectors is going to be a stepping stone to also make things easier between the sectors.
Excellent. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the panelists that will be joining us for the next half an hour discussion. So it's my pleasure to be welcoming on our virtual stage, first of all, member of the European Parliament, Dace Melverde. She's also the vice chair of the Cult Committee in the European Parliament. And also, it's a pleasure to have with us Mr. Paul Keller, Policy Director at Open Future. Good morning to the two of you.
Good morning.
Great.
Good
so,
morning.
good morning. So perhaps I think we can kick off by following up a little bit on what we've been hearing today of the idea of the European data spaces and how can it interconnect with the commons and with the digital public spaces. So perhaps Ms. Melverde, would you like to be kicking in with the discussion?
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I have to apologize. I had difficulties to follow the morning session because of technical issues, and I hope I will still stay with you for this half an hour. So I will try then to react to the questions I have received beforehand. And speaking about there was a question about the key ingredients that make a healthy digital public space. To answer in some words, it will be trust, digital identity, and of course, digital skills and infrastructure is something very crucial. But I'd like to start talking and touching upon issue of trust. And I think that trust must be the cornerstone for any digital public space. Indeed, trust goes in many directions. First, the users have to be able to know that the interactions are safe, that they know the data they hand out and that these data are handled properly. Also, well as that the systems running the digital space are sturdy and reliable. And no less importantly, people need to have a proper access and understanding as to what a digital space is. So media and information literacy, and in the more simple terms, people being able not to fall prey to disinformation, as well as them being technically literate to make use of the digital space, are all important factors. Then I think that one of the big challenges is identity, digital identity. As you may know, the European Parliament will soon start handling the file on European digital identity, a legislative file for which I'm one of the shadow rapporteurs. Whereas discussions center around the technical aspects of making a European digital identity, the more philosophical ones are no less important. For instance, we may all be satisfied with the technical solutions offered by the large platforms, but we also know that many of the profiles, be it Twitter or Facebook, are alter egos at best and fake users and bots at worst. So we cannot talk about a healthy democratic debates online when so much of the space is used by fake personalities, often with nefarious agenda behind them. And then from the presentations introducing this conference, I have to agree for 100% that digital skills and infrastructure, it's of course one of the core issues to be raised. It's on often cited statistics, but unfortunately still true. Just slightly above half of the EU population have the most basic digital skills. In some countries, this number is lower still, meaning that the majority of some population don't know how to use a computer, or even or they are never online. So, but the pandemic is speeding up digitalization. There is really an urgent need to improve the digital skills and literacy of the EU citizens. And in this regard, European education area, and more particularly the Digital Education Action Plan, is a step in the right direction. At the very least, it puts the lack of digital skills as one of the central problems. So, but much more needs to be done at the pace of upskilling in this area. We must move beyond the basic digital skills if we are to achieve a highly skilled and knowledgeable society. And the right infrastructure must also be taken care of. It's not only about tablets and laptops, but also high-speed internet at law, or if possible, not cost, especially in the EU's outermost regions. So these are my first remarks then.
Thank you very much, Ms. Melberg. We have a lot, I think, to discuss in the next minutes. So I would like to move now to Paul Keller. Great to have you with us. I would like to kick off with you with a question on what do you think is the unique value that cultural heritage can bring in shaping these digital spaces, and perhaps also related to what we were just discussing before on whether in this European framework, perhaps cultural heritage should have a space on its own right, instead of, for instance, collaborating with health or tourism.
Yes, sure. So first of all, let me thank you for having me here, and also let me express how happy I am by some of the announcements that we heard this morning, like this. Congratulations, George, with the Flickr Foundation. This is really great news. It's one of the services I've been using from the beginning, and these questions around sustainability that you've expressed with such eloquence are like really things that I worry about, have worried about a lot, and I guess worry about much less now. I'm also like really happy about hearing about the Commission adopted the recommendation, because in a way, I think this really validates some of the work that Europeana has done, that we at Europeana have done over the past 15 years, right? This idea of a European data space for cultural heritage is something that we've actually developed at Europeana before that term even existed in the Commission's lingo, right? Like Europeana is this idea of bringing together the resources of all these institutions, pulling them in one open, accessible data space that is open to all of us who contribute to it, but also to the larger parts of society, as Ivo in other sectors, as Ivo has explained, right? Like, and this shows to me, like, also that the cultural heritage sector is not only about preservation and like keeping the old stuff around. No, like we're also a center of social innovation, right? Like of innovation. We've in a way pushed this concept forward, and seeing this validated in the recommendation, but also seeing that in the broader Commission's data strategy applied to other sectors is also something like I think we can reasonably be proud about. And that brings me really to the idea, reflecting a little bit on the role that Europeana plays in this bigger question about digital public space, right? Like Europeana is, in a way, for me, always been a much bigger thing than just Europeana itself, because it shows Europe's ambition to actually intervene in this space, in this digital space, and say, like, we're shaping something. We're investing money into making things happen that the market would not make happen on its own. Europeana is an example of it. In the grand scale of things, a relatively small example, if we look at all the size of the developments going around us. But it shows that Europe, if it wants to, can join forces and invest into this space and create new things and can create different things. And I think that's one very important lesson that we should learn from Europeana here. And I think I'll just stop here as parts of my introduction, and then maybe go a little bit more in the discussion on some of the details of this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So if we can kick off the debate, and I think I'm going to go quite straight to the point, because if we talk about EU data spaces, they will need content, right? So what do you think that EU member states should be doing in order to support digital cultural heritage institutions in providing this content? Perhaps I can come back first to George for this question.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Well, I was happy to hear that digitization is kind of back on the table and continuing to fund that operation inside cultural heritage organizations. But there's also a really big piece connected and often sort of neglected around digitization, which is description. And what we know now is that these descriptions of the digitized objects need to be multifaceted. So when you talk about metadata representing an object, you can say, you know, this is made of clay, it's 30 centimeters high, stuff like that. But you can also say it was made by this man in this place, or, you know, the meaning of this object is this, and this. And that sort of work takes real time. You know, it's easy to photograph a thing and then save a JPEG on a hard drive. It's hard and time consuming to describe it really well. And even to have two people describe the one thing, you know. So I think investment in that capacity for cultural heritage organizations would be really good in the coming decades. And, you know, it's going to take decades. And again, if we are able to take this long-term perspective and amortize cost over, let's say, a century, you know, and then we say, let's give ourselves a century to have a digital replica of everything and a good description of everything. It's sort of, you know, it's just a different perspective. And the other thing, sorry, before I pass the mic, is I would love to see initiatives around youth employment in cultural heritage, because I think that's a real kind of missing piece. And, you know, that cynicism that I was referencing in my presentation before, I think, you know, we see a lot of youth activism and a lot of youth community mobilizing and stuff like that. So there's obviously a real, you know, social cohesion amongst our young people, but we're not sort of translating that into history and, you know, understanding of the humanities. So I think focusing on getting young folks into cultural heritage organizations is something I'd really like to see.
Thank you very much, George. Ivo, would you like to follow up on it? I think you're muted, Ivo. Or don't think we can hear you. Otherwise, shall we perhaps first move to MEP Melverde, and then get back to you, Ivo. That's okay.
Yes, speaking about cultural and creative sectors and industries, they do deserve their own data space, and it may come to fruition eventually, but the fact that it's not among the predefined common European data space proposed by the Commission, I think it's a missed opportunity. Similarly, creative culture sector need to be involved at other aspects pertaining to the EU's digital strategy. I was a shadow rapporteur for the Data Governance Act, which is one of the core elements that will help enable and shape the EU's digital ambitions. And we at the Parliament made sure that the foreseen European Data Innovation Board does include representatives from the media and cultural and creative sectors and industries. And the Commission's original proposal unfortunately lacked the relevant stakeholders. To elaborate, cultural and creative sectors can give and are giving a lot to the EU culturally and economically, but opportunities. But it must also be able to benefit more thoroughly from the opportunities the digital domain offers. even for culture, the cross-border exchange of data is important as our interoperable standards and the more general sectoral data governance, for instance, regarding contracts, access rights, and licensing. So, and on to the question about cultural heritage, I think it should be reiterated that in the report on achieving an efficient policy legacy to the European Year of Cultural Heritage, we did talk extensively about the need not to only preserve but also promote cultural heritage. In this regard, I relay and I really want to applaud the immense work that Europeana is doing. But as we all well know, if we are serious about cultural heritage and its transition to digital age, more ambition and funding is really needed. And the way I see it, Europeana and the cultural heritage stakeholders and their networks can and must play a big role in advising the Commission about the best ways how the EU can protect and promote cultural heritage, but also how cultural heritage can aid the digital efforts more broadly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Ms. Malverde. Before trying to connect back with Ivo, who I think has joined us, perhaps we can have Paul jumping in.
Yes, thank you. So I think the question about what member states can do, right, is to some degree, and I agree with a lot of the things that the speakers before me have said, but I would also point to something that has been the focus of the Europeana network in the past, and I've worked a lot on, is we are just getting new copyright rules for cultural heritage institutions in the European Union. Some of the member states have implemented these rules. A number of ones are in the process of implementing them. And I think member states really should look how they can help cultural heritage institutions to really make best use of these things, right? Like, they are for the first time rules which would allow institutions to really solve copyright problems on a fairly large collection base uses. They are complicated rules which require some collaboration with collective management organizations, with rights holders, but there really is a lot of potential in there. And this is something where member states can really maybe facilitate dialogue and really like work with institutions to see how they can best help them to make these materials available, because that will also give us much more access to material which is relatively recent, which we know is very much interesting from the perspective of educators, from the perspective of people looking around for information, etc. So I think the one point, in addition to everything else that was said so far, is like really also member states work with cultural heritage institutions on a collective level to make use of these rules and get much more material available online.
Super, Paul. May I quickly check if we have Ivo back with us?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Or
yes, we can hear you well.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Many things. I missed a bit of the conversation. Sorry for that. But a first comment I would like to make is that I listened to Paul, and he asked whether what we do with the recommendation, whether that actually validates everything that has been done by Europeana so far. And indeed, it does validate everything that Europeana has done so far. And also, it puts the cultural heritage institutions at the center as a vehicle for innovation, for creation. And indeed, that's a very important concept. Now, on the question what member states can do, a lot has been said already. Funding for digitization is very important, and making sure that if there's funding for digitization, that the material then gets into Europeana. That's the second important thing, because it has to come together to have these interactions between the different bits and pieces. I remember starting out with Europeana, how fantastic it was that you could find images and music from and about Mozart from all the different museums across Europe. And that was fantastic. And from the libraries, and combining that, yeah, that really was something. Now, another point where member states need to invest is indeed skills. Dacia has mentioned that very prominently. The upskilling and reskilling of the cultural heritage staff is going to be very important to be fully engaged with the digital topics. And then the last thing I would like to mention is strengthening the role of the national aggregators. That's again about bringing the material into Europeana and make sure that everyone can find it in one place and can use it in an easy way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Ivo. Great to have you back with us. I'm not sure if any of the speakers would like to be following up from this previous round. Mm-hmm. George, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny to hear this conversation because I think a cheeky Cedric Price quote comes to mind, which is technology is the answer, but what was the question? You know, I feel like this conversation is actually very much siloing the work of cultural heritage professionals and presenting it as a thing that needs to be treated in isolation. And you know, there needs to be attention paid to that sector specifically in terms of resourcing and so forth. But I guess the point that I was trying to make about this sort of blurring around cultural heritage is that if we look at what's happening today and where cultural heritage production is happening today, it's all over the internet. You know, it's not just behind the doors in museums. You know, kids taking pictures with their phones, people documenting their culture on YouTube, you know, all kinds of stuff. And I fear that if we apply, you know, high-level technology aspirations to the cultural heritage sector without really acknowledging how those boundaries between public and private spaces are blurring, you know, I fear that it will all just be kind of retroactive support instead of forward thinking and contemporary reactions to things. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just feel like it's important for cultural heritage organizations to not be stuck behind walls, which they have been. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, George. We have just a few minutes to go. I mean, this panel has gone by really fast. Yes, please, just a quick reaction, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I just want to react to, because like I think it's a really important issue that George just raised, and I think what I see here and what I would urge us and especially the European Commission, which is working on this idea of digital principles and a long-term strategy, would urge is really to also take into account that there are a lot of things that need to be fixed about the current digital environment, but there is also a lot of things where we can build things that are public infrastructures that can be modeled after ideas like Europeana. Europeana is very deliberate, or started as a very deliberate intervention in this space, which basically said, we cannot leave access to cultural heritage to, in that case, it was Google Books, but like I think it was larger, like large American corporations, right? And the points that you raise, like we also need to create these public places where the kids can share the photos, right? Like public in the sense of things that are under public accountability, where we have a say about how these things develop, and that requires some level of, I think in the end, also investment from member states, from the Commission, from Europe into trying to build these things. And we see, like we know from Europeana, it's not easy to build these things, but like if you really have a good idea what you want to build, you'll get there eventually. And so like I really think maybe it's a slightly different way of looking at it, of blurring the lines around cultural heritage. This is an idea that we need to like apply also in other parts of our digital lives.
Mm-hmm. And then if we could perhaps like start having a bit of a wrap up from this discussion, how do you all think that we can make these topics relevant to a wider audience? That's something that Ivo had asked earlier, and I think also MEP Melverde also hinted that that perhaps the conversation risks becoming a bit too technical and missing a bit the philosophical aspect. So how do we address that? If we could start with MEP Melverde, perhaps. Not sure if she's with us, but you are muted. Excellent.
Unfortunately, I'm losing connection time to time. I couldn't understand your question. Could you please repeat?
Absolutely. How do we bring citizens on board? How do we include them, the wider audience, into these conversations on the future of digital cultural heritage and the spaces where it develops and flourishes?
Okay, so I think that I believe the right question to ask regarding audience involvement is what happens if we do not involve the wide public, in particularly those over 40% of Europeans who lack even the basic digital skills. So the vast majority of information by now is online, and we could just think, even if you continue reading your newspaper in a paper format, there is even more information available on the newspaper's website. Or if you want to find, say, the latest information about the coronavirus restrictions in your country or another, the information is online on government websites. So a lot of information is and never will be printed or broadcast on radio or on TV, and we have to acknowledge it. So the simple answer is by bringing more people into a digital space, we prevent the trend whereby implicitly a two-tier society or society is being created. The digital haves and digital have-nots. So I would say that it is very important, again, and I repeat, to invest in digital skills. So,
thank you. Paul, perhaps we can have a follow-up from you.
Okay. So I think, and this is an idea which I don't remember who came up with this. We had a consultation with a couple of people working in the sector, and somebody said, like, we also need to tell stories about where we want to go, right? Like, and one of the dominant stories in tech at the moment is this idea of the metaverse, right? Like, and somebody said, like, we really, as a sector, we need to have something, we need to engage with these stories, we need to have our own stories. Why don't we start talking about something called, they coined it the publiverse, right? Like, have an idea of where we want to go, like this stuff which excites people about the technology, the visions of technology that are painted by the big corporate players in the space, and also think about how we can paint visions like that ourselves. So I like that very much. Maybe that's a way of engaging people more with what this sector does and like the role that the sector can play in the future. And thank you for the conversation also.
Thank you very much. George, one key idea, how can we bring a wider audience on board in these discussions?
Well, I think traditionally the audience for cultural heritage practice is quite small. You know, it's the cultural heritage sector. We're the ones who think about how to do it and when to do things. I think recently there's been a lot more interest and scrutiny in the way cultural heritage is practiced and protected and described. So I think there's an opportunity here to engage these new and interested and critical audiences in the way the cultural heritage sector does its work. I think there's a lot of contemporary and fresh ideas and voices that the cultural heritage sector needs to hear. And, you know, it can be quite confronting to figure out how to engage with new voices who are critical. It's not traditionally a strength of the cultural heritage sector, I would say. But I think there's appetite out there in the world. And I think there's also a lot of concern out there in the world about, how personal data is treated, and some of the features and elements that Dace was bringing up around identity and trust. I think the populace in general are concerned about those things if they have the literacy, which obviously is an issue. Not everybody, can necessarily reflect on those challenges. But I think, for me at least, the literacy question applies to the population in general, not just around cultural heritage. We have to help citizens understand how their data is used by corporations and public bodies. So if for my money, it is a literacy challenge.
Excellent. One last thought, one last key idea from Ivo, last but not least.
Yeah, no, many thanks. Indeed, make the cultural heritage material available to build and develop stuff that interests people. The exciting extended reality developments, for example, well, cultural heritage should be part of that. And then I remember the World War I project of Europeana, where basically they invited people to come in with the material that they had at home from World War I. And that was amazing, the stuff that came in and was digitized in terms of letters, in terms of objects. I thought that was a very successful way of involving people and bringing the stories from people together from the different countries. So more of that kind of thing, perhaps.
Thank you, Ivo, and thank you very much, everyone, once again, for having joined us in this first day of Europeana 2021, in this morning plenary session, and kicking off with a very, very lively and very, very interesting debate of the challenges ahead. So thank you very much to everyone once again for joining us.